In this lesson, we'll explore the interface of the Visual Basic Editor. As a reminder, there are two ways that we can access the VBE. The first is by clicking the Visual Basic button on the Developer tab right here. That will launch us into the VBE. The second is to use the keyboard shortcut from Excel, which is going to be Alt plus F11. If you forget that shortcut, you can simply hover your mouse over this button and it'll appear here in the little highlight that pops up. Alt plus F11. So let's go ahead and click that, and that'll take us into the Visual Basic Editor. So the VBE, or the Visual Basic Editor, is a totally separate program from Excel. It's dependent on it, it needs it to run, but it's a totally separate application in itself. It runs with its own interface, its own set of toolbars, its own set of settings. So you can imagine them as two separate entities. Because the VBE is designed for more technically oriented people, the programmers and developers and the like, its interface certainly isn't as pretty as Excel's, but you'll find as you play around with it that it's still pretty simple and pretty functional. So let's explore the different parts of the VBE, starting with this top left section, which we call the Project Explorer. The Project Explorer window is typically placed on the top left, but you can go ahead and click this bar and drag this window and dock it anywhere you want in the actual window that we see here, the VBE. The Project Explorer lists all open workbooks and add-ins sort of as a tree diagram with nodes. It's very similar to what you might see in Windows Explorer when you're looking at directories and all the files within them. It's kind of a nested structure that stores the logic of all of the objects that are within the spreadsheet. What I mean by objects are all of the data entities within every workbook. So right here at the very top, we have our VBA project, which represents the currently open workbook, absolute versus relative references. This is the exact same workbook that I worked with in the last lesson when I created the automatically generated code. Below, we have a folder called Microsoft Excel Objects, and that's going to store an object, or essentially a data structure, to represent every single worksheet. Right now in this workbook, I only have one worksheet. It's called Sheet 1, so here it is right now highlighted in blue. But if I had more worksheets, they would all be listed here kind of as a drop-down list. And finally, at the end, I have this workbook, which represents the entire workbook as a whole. Now, primarily, most of the code that we're going to be writing in the course is going to take place or be written in modules. And so modules are organized still within the same project, but within a totally separate folder called modules. By default, as we create modules, or as the macro recorder generates them for us, they're going to be named numerically in order. So module 1, module 2, module 3, and so on. But we can go ahead and change the names of these as we proceed if we want to organize related procedures into different modules. So for example, we may have a module for mathematical operations, one for worksheet operations, one for workbook operations, one for specific reports, things like that. It's just a way to organize our code into different buckets. A module, again, is just a container for procedures, and procedures are just snippets of VBA code that perform some kind of operation. All modules will be listed here under the modules folder, and a single module is actually limited to 64,000 characters. We can see here, in order to actually see what's in the module, we can double click it. That's going to open the content in the code editor on the right, and here we see all of the code that's currently saved within this module. It's two procedures for us, this move right absolute and move right relative. As soon as I click on any of these other objects within the Microsoft Excel Objects folder, you can see there's no code currently written in there. So whenever we're looking for our code, we have to go to wherever it was originally saved. In this case, it's in module 1. So VBE will open a brand new code window for each module or worksheet that we click. We're going to see all of our code right here. By default, we're going to have these horizontal lines that separate each one of our procedures, so we have a visual indicator of where one ends and one begins. We're going to dive into this option a little bit later. On the top right here in this drop-down, we have the ability to select any one of our procedures to go to the place in the module where it's defined. So right now we only have two, so it's kind of not really an effective feature because we can see everything on screen. But you can imagine if we have 15 or 20 different procedures in a single module, they're all going to appear right here. We can very easily click on one of them, and it's going to bring us to that section of the code. Down here on the left side of the Visual Basic Editor, we have the Properties window. If for some reason you don't see the Properties window, you can always click View up top here, and Properties window will be listed right here. It's also enabled by the keyboard shortcut F4. By the way, if you don't see the Project Explorer, which is the thing on the top left that lists all the modules, that's this thing right here. You can click that as well if for some reason it's disappeared, or use the keyboard shortcut Control++R. It may pop up somewhere else on the screen undocked. If that's the case, just click and grab it and drag it to where you want it to stay on the screen. We'll dive into properties a little bit later in the course, but you can think of properties as configuration settings or options for a specific data entity within our system. So on our module, for example, we only have one property, and it's called name right here, and we can use that property to change specific values. So if we want to change the name of this module, which is currently module 1, we can change it. So for example, we can do something here like deletion procedures. Press enter to save. You can see the name has changed below, and it's also changed up here. So we've used properties to alter the name of the module. It's a little bit more of an advanced concept, but essentially as we click around different objects, we're going to have different settings, different configurations that we can set depending on what the data structure is, depending on what the data entity is, because of course what a workbook can do is different from what a worksheet can do, from what a module can do. So each thing in our application is going to have its own bucket of settings, and the properties window is where we adjust and configure those settings. Finally, down here on the bottom, we have the immediate window. If for some reason you don't see this window, let me just go ahead and close it. The keyboard shortcut for that is Control G, and the alternative way to access it, I'm just going to close it again, is going to the View, drop down, and there should be an immediate window setting right here. That's the exact same thing. You can see the shortcut. That brings up the immediate window. The immediate window is a console of sorts. It's a playground. That's the best way that I can think of it. It's a place where you can test little snippets of code. So it's not designed for writing an entire procedure from scratch. It's not designed for any kind of lengthy operations. But whenever you want to check how, for example, a single line of code would execute without packaging it within a procedure, without going through that hassle, you can test kind of snippets of code here very briefly. For example, I can perform a basic mathematical calculation or check the current value of a cell in my Excel window. So as an example, we're going to dive into the syntax later, but if I want to find out what 1 plus 1 is, I can place a question mark here. That's sort of asking the immediate window a question. I can put some kind of expression like 1 plus 1, press enter, and get the value of 2. So really simple operations, really simple things that we want to check. One-liners of code, maybe 2 lines at maximum. Whenever we want to test something really small, we use the immediate window. Whenever it's something larger, we're just going to package it within a procedure. We can also use the immediate window, by the way, to check the current values of properties. So we can use it to check current settings, see what they're currently set to, things like that. We're going to dive into that in much greater detail when we explore the immediate window in a section or two from now. And that's basically the whole interface of the Visual Basic Editor. There are additional options available right here in all of the drop-down menu options, but we're going to explore those in detail a little bit later. So to close or exit the VBE, it's a totally separate program, so when we close it, it doesn't affect Excel in any way. All we have to do is just click the X button at the top right. That closes us out of the VBE. There is a keyboard shortcut as well, so let me go ahead and open it. The keyboard shortcut to exit the VBE is Alt plus Q. I'm going to press that right now. Brings us back to our Excel interface. So again, we do not need to have the VBE running. Excel is a totally separate application. It can run by itself. But when we do have the Visual Basic Editor running, we do need Excel open because it is dependent on it to essentially get its data and manipulate it. So that's a quick exploration of the Visual Basic Editor. It's a lot to take in, but we talked about the Properties window, the Immediate window, the Code Editor, the Project Explorer, and we're going to dive into all of these sections in much greater detail. We're going to explore them one by one, but essentially it's just a way to organize our project. On the Project Explorer, we're going to have all of our available projects, our objects within them. By objects, I mean worksheets, workbooks, etc. In the Properties window, we're going to be able to configure our settings. In the Code Editor, we're going to be able to actually write our code and our procedures. And in the Immediate window, we're going to use it as a console of sorts to test values, do a dry run through certain procedures, test a couple small things here and there, minor operations like that. And that's basically it. Once you memorize those 4 pieces, that's most of the VBE interface, and you'll be surprised how quickly you can pick it up. That's all there is to cover here, so I'll see you in the next lesson.